Picture this. You're only 7 years old, running barefoot through the dusty lanes of your small Christian village in the Balkans. Suddenly, Ottoman officials appear at your doorstep. They aren't here to collect taxes. They aren't here for grain or livestock. They're here for you. By nightfall, you are gone, torn from your family's arms, and your parents will never see you again. The Ottoman Empire endured for more than 6 centuries, stretching across 3 continents and ruling over millions of souls. It is often remembered for its architectural marvels, brilliant sultans, and dazzling military conquests. The empire left behind mosques that pierced the skyline, palaces filled with splendor, and a bureaucracy admired even by its enemies. But behind that golden facade lay a reality almost never spoken of. A reality that stripped children of their identities, mutilated bodies, and turned human sexuality into an instrument of terror and control. These weren't isolated scandals or aberrant episodes. They were deliberate, institutionalized practices that reshaped entire generations. What you're about to hear isn't folklore or rumor. It comes directly from Ottoman records, from the eyewitness reports of diplomats and travelers, and from archaeological remains scattered across the empire's former territories. The disturbing truth is that the Ottomans documented these practices with the same precision they used to record taxes and trade. Sexual exploitation wasn't a byproduct of Ottoman rule. It was woven into the very machinery of governance. Officials tracked children like livestock, listed women like merchandise, and calculated the economic returns of human suffering. The most chilling element wasn't simply what happened, but how carefully it was organized. Bureaucrats kept ledgers of boys taken from villages, detailed the brutal arithmetic of castration, and set standardized prices for women's bodies in the slave markets of Constantinople. This was not random cruelty. This was a system designed, perfected, and normalized. And to truly understand the shadow of the Ottoman Empire, we must begin with the policy that shattered the lives of countless families for centuries. The Devshirme, or blood tax, a levy not of money, but of children. Every few years, Ottoman officials swept through the Christian villages of the Balkans. They came with no warning, armed not with weapons but with registers, cold, methodical lists that recorded every family, every son, every child of the right age. These officials weren't there to collect grain or coins, they were there to collect children. This practice, known as the Devshirme, or blood tax, was one of the most systematic programs of forced child recruitment in history. Boys between the ages of 7 and 20 were prime targets, though the preferred age was much younger. Accounts even describe toddlers as young as 4 being torn from their mother's arms. The process was terrifyingly efficient. Officials examined each boy as if inspecting livestock, checking their teeth, their health, their posture, their intelligence, and above all, their appearance. To the bureaucrats of the empire, these weren't children. They were raw material, blank canvases upon which the state could inscribe new identities. Once selected, the boys were immediately separated from anyone who spoke their native tongue. They were forbidden to use their Christian names, forbidden to recall their families. Any sign of attachment to their former life was met with brutal punishment. Within months, many could no longer remember who they once were. Their childhoods, their cultures, even their very names were erased. These children were converted to Islam, trained in Ottoman customs, and remade into instruments of imperial power. The empire wasn't just claiming bodies, it was reconstructing minds. Some were destined for the Janissary Corps, the empire's elite military formation. To outsiders, it looked like a path of honor and glory. Boys from humble villages transformed into soldiers feared across Europe and the Middle East. But this too came with a hidden cost. The Janissaries were forced to remain celibate, their loyalty demanded entirely by the Sultan. Their only bonds of intimacy were with each other. Over time, this created a military culture where same-sex relationships were not only tolerated but institutionalized. The empire even created a specialized unit, the Civilek Battalion, to channel and control these relationships, ensuring discipline while exploiting sexuality for military cohesion. Advancement within the corps could depend on sexual submission to superiors, but not every boy became a soldier. The most physically attractive, those deemed too beautiful for war, were set aside for another purpose. They were taken into the palace, their lives spiraling into roles of servitude, far darker than the battlefield. Here, in the heart of the empire, they would serve the Sultan and his court in ways that defied both dignity and comprehension. For some boys taken through the Devshirme, the battlefield was not their fate, nor even the palace courts. Instead, they faced something far more gruesome: castration. The Ottoman court required eunuchs in large numbers, men stripped of their reproductive ability to serve in the most intimate spaces of the empire. To obtain them, the Ottomans relied on a brutal system, carried out mostly in Egypt and Ethiopia, where Islamic prohibitions against castration could be circumvented by having Christians or Jews perform the operation. The procedure itself was horrifying. Tools were primitive, medical knowledge limited. In most cases, the child's testicles were crushed or removed. In harsher forms, the entire genitalia was cut away. The pain was unimaginable. Infection was common. Blood loss was deadly. For every 10 boys subjected to the knife, only one survived. The rest died in agony. Yet the empire's bureaucrats calculated these deaths with chilling detachment. If the palace required 100 eunuchs, then 1,000 boys would be mutilated. 900 deaths were simply the cost of supply. This was the mathematics of cruelty, where human suffering was reduced to cold arithmetic. Survivors were divided into two main categories. African boys, who typically underwent complete removal of genitalia, became known as black eunuchs. They were trusted within the Sultan's harem, often rising to positions of power as guardians of the women's quarters. Some became influential figures, controlling access to the Sultan himself. European boys, especially from the Balkans, often experienced partial castration, losing only their testicles. These white eunuchs served primarily in administrative roles, working as palace officials, secretaries, or intermediaries between court and military. But regardless of their station, all eunuchs shared the same fate: a life stripped of natural intimacy. They could never marry, they could never have children. They were cut off not only from their families but from the possibility of ever creating families of their own. The psychological toll was devastating. These boys had not only been mutilated physically, they had been severed from the basic rhythms of human life itself. They existed only as instruments of the empire, their entire existence reduced to service. The Ottomans did not view this as cruelty. In their eyes, eunuchs were essential, reliable servants who, because of their condition, posed no threat to the honor of women in the harem, and no dynastic threat to the Sultan's family. But behind that logic lay a mountain of corpses, children sacrificed to preserve imperial control. And for those who escaped the surgeon's knife, another fate awaited, one that blurred gender, erased identity, and transformed boys into public entertainment. Not every boy taken into the Ottoman system was sent to the battlefield or mutilated to serve as a eunuch. Some were spared the surgeon's knife but condemned to a different kind of servitude, lives of performance, humiliation, and sexual exploitation. One such role was that of the Köçek dancer. These were young boys, chosen for their beauty, dressed in women's clothing, and trained to perform at feasts, weddings, and imperial celebrations. Their dances blurred the line between genders, turning them into living spectacles of androgyny. At first glance, these performances might appear as harmless entertainment, but the reality was far darker. The audiences, often filled with drunken officials, soldiers, and nobles, treated the dancers not as performers, but as prey. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes of chaos, men screaming with desire, glasses shattered in fights, and even murders committed in the frenzy of trying to claim a boy for the night. For the Köçek themselves, there was no escape. They were expected to submit to whatever advances followed their performances. Their bodies were treated as part of the entertainment package, offered up as extensions of the show. The system became so closely associated with violence and sexual assault that, eventually, Ottoman authorities were forced to suppress it. Yet this decision came only after countless boys had endured years of systematic abuse. If the Köçek were exploited publicly, the Tavşanoğlan, or bunny boys, suffered in secrecy. This hidden institution was perhaps the most disturbing of all. Young Christian boys, often Greek or from Balkan communities, were taken specifically to serve the sexual desires of high-ranking Ottoman officials. Unlike the Köçek, the Tavşanoğlan were never paraded in public. They had no official roles, no recognition, and no protection. They existed entirely in the shadows, hidden away in palace quarters, used solely for gratification. They were not recorded in ledgers of soldiers or slaves, but their existence is documented in fragments, just enough to reveal the outlines of a system deliberately concealed. For these boys, there was no path of advancement, no hope of freedom. Their families received no word of their fate, no letters, no signs of life. Parents waited in silence, year after year, not knowing that their children had been swallowed by a system designed to erase them completely. What makes this even more horrifying is how the cycle perpetuated itself. Some boys, broken and reshaped by the system, grew into adults who returned to the Balkans to select the next generation of victims. Former victims became agents of the very machinery that had destroyed them, ensuring that the chain of trauma never ended. Through the Köçek and the Tavşanoğlan, the empire demonstrated something chilling. Sexuality wasn't just exploited, it was choreographed, institutionalized, and weaponized both in the public square and in the most secret chambers of the palace. But the Ottoman exploitation of boys was only half the story. The empire also built an enormous, industrial-scale system of sexual slavery for women, one that dwarfed anything the contemporary world had ever seen. If the exploitation of boys was chilling, the Ottoman system for women unfolded on an even larger, industrial scale. The empire built an entire economy around the capture, training, and sale of women, transforming human bodies into commodities traded as casually as spices or silk. At the heart of this system was Constantinople's slave market, a vast and organized network that operated with the efficiency of a modern corporation. Women were not simply bought and sold, they were catalogued, classified, and priced according to strict hierarchies. Age, race, virginity, and perceived beauty determined value. An African girl might be sold for between 1,500 and 2,500 kuruş if intended for labor. But if she was destined for sexual use, her price could double or triple. European women, especially Greeks, Circassians, and Balkan captives, were considered the most desirable. Some fetched sums equivalent to entire estates. At the very top of this pyramid were the odalisques, women specially trained for the Sultan's harem. Their price could soar into the tens of thousands of kuruş, fortunes so vast they rivaled the wealth of governors and generals. The empire even ran training schools for captured women. Here, young girls were taught the arts of seduction, massage, music, and conversation. Their trauma was repackaged into performance. By the time they reached the palace or the household of a wealthy official, they were no longer seen as victims but as refined instruments of pleasure. Yet the glamour associated with the word harem in Western imagination bears no resemblance to reality. Inside the Sultan's harem, most women lived in fear. They competed desperately for attention, each hoping to rise from mere slave to favoured concubine. This competition was by design. Women were pitted against each other in humiliating contests, forced to perform degrading acts to prove their worth. Failure often meant beatings, starvation, or even death. The empire ensured there was no solidarity. Women were encouraged to spy on each other, betray confidences, and sabotage rivals. Trust was impossible. Every smile might conceal a dagger. In this environment, human bonds dissolved, replaced by paranoia and rivalry. The fate of children born within this system was perhaps most tragic of all. Infanticide was shockingly common, especially for babies born to African mothers. Contemporary observers noted how few mixed-race children were visible in Constantinople, despite the presence of tens of thousands of African women. The truth was inescapable. Many of these infants were killed at birth, erased to preserve the racial hierarchy of the imperial household. Those who survived long enough to age out of desirability faced bleak futures. Some were sold into brothels, others were abandoned, left to beg or starve. Many were simply killed, disposed of, once their youth and beauty had faded. The Ottoman system had no pensions, no retirement, no recognition of their humanity. The legal codes of the empire reinforced this dehumanization. The rape of a free woman could bring the death penalty, but the rape of a slave woman, that was treated as property damage, punishable by a fine. A slave woman had no rights over her body. Her children, too, belonged entirely to her master, who could sell, abandon, or kill them at will. Through this legal and economic framework, the Ottomans didn't just tolerate exploitation, they built an empire upon it. Women were not people, they were assets, investments, sources of revenue. The scale was staggering. At any given time, hundreds of thousands of enslaved women lived in Constantinople alone. Entire military campaigns were planned with the explicit goal of capturing more women. Human beings became resources of war, measured and counted like cattle. But exploitation didn't stop with the market or the harem. It reached into the public square, where sexual violence itself was transformed into a form of entertainment. The Ottoman Empire did not simply institutionalize sexual exploitation in private quarters or slave markets. It carried that logic into the public square, where violence itself became a performance. Sexual humiliation and torture were staged as entertainment rituals designed both to punish and to amuse. In Ottoman law, the value of a human life was divided into categories. The rape of a free woman carried the death penalty. The rape of a slave woman, however, was treated as a property dispute, punished only with a fine no different than damaging a horse or breaking a tool. In this legal framework, women were reduced to commodities. The system made sexual violence not just tolerated, but economically rational. But the cruelty extended further. Those convicted of sexual crimes were often executed in ways designed to mirror their offences. Punishment became a grotesque theatre. A man guilty of sodomy might be impaled. A rapist might be mutilated before the crowd. These weren't swift executions. They were prolonged rituals, choreographed to maximise pain, humiliation and spectacle. Crowds gathered as if attending a festival. They jeered, they shouted suggestions, they placed wagers on how long a victim would survive. What should have been justice was transformed into public entertainment, where the suffering of the condemned was consumed as spectacle by the masses. Archaeological evidence from execution sites confirms these accounts. Excavations reveal bodies not simply killed, but systematically desecrated signs of mutilation, specifically targeting sexual organs. The aim was clear, not just to kill, but to annihilate the victim's sexual identity, to erase them as human beings. This normalization of cruelty had a corrosive effect on society. Children grew up watching human suffering treated as sport. They learned from an early age that sexuality could be bought, sold, or destroyed at will. Violence was no longer a crime. It was a public ritual, sanctioned by law, enjoyed by the crowd. Such spectacles reinforced the empire's central message: power over the body was absolute. Whether through castration, concubinage, or execution, the Ottoman state demonstrated that no individual controlled their own flesh. The empire alone held that right. Over time, this culture of normalized violence seeped into every level of society. Families lived in constant fear that their children could be taken. Parents disfigured their own sons and daughters, scarring their faces, breaking their teeth, or even crippling their limbs to make them less attractive to Ottoman collectors. Love itself was twisted into acts of desperation. This was the ultimate achievement of the empire's system. A world where even the most intimate bonds between parent and child, between man and woman, were corrupted by fear of exploitation. And yet, this machinery of sexual control was not only a cultural phenomenon, it was also a financial engine, one of the key pillars of Ottoman imperial wealth. The Ottoman system of sexual exploitation was not merely tolerated as a cultural practice, it was embedded into the empire's economy. Far from being a marginal enterprise, slavery and sexual commerce formed one of the pillars of imperial finance. The revenues from the slave trade funded wars, built palaces, and kept the bureaucratic machine of the empire running. Markets in Constantinople, Cairo, and beyond operated year-round, generating wealth comparable to taxation or land rents. Captives were not just spoils of war, they were currency, exchanged in treaties, gifted as diplomatic offerings, or used to pay debts. Ottoman expansion itself was often driven by this demand. Military campaigns into the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Africa weren't solely about territorial gain, they were also about human acquisition. Generals calculated not just how many forts could be taken, but how many women and children could be seized, sold, and absorbed into the system. The empire established entire trade routes dedicated to human trafficking. Caravans moved slaves from the interior of Africa and the steppes of Central Asia to the markets of Anatolia. Fleets transported women captured from Mediterranean coasts to the capital. Even diplomatic agreements contained clauses about the exchange or taxation of slaves. Inside the palace, detailed ledgers documented the origins, ages, and prices of enslaved people. Inventories listed women in harems as if they were furniture. Correspondence between officials openly discussed the sexual preferences of their superiors and how best to satisfy them through procurement. To Ottoman administrators, these records carried no shame. They were bureaucratic data, as routine as grain tallies or military rosters. Foreign ambassadors, horrified by what they witnessed, sent back detailed reports, but most European powers did little to intervene. For them, Ottoman trade routes were too valuable to jeopardize over the fate of enslaved children or concubines. Even worse, some client states began to emulate Ottoman practices, adopting similar systems of concubinage and slave markets. The Ottoman model of exploitation spread far beyond its borders, leaving scars across neighboring societies. And when the empire began to decline in the 19th and early 20th centuries, these practices did not vanish overnight. They morphed, adapted, and left behind deep cultural and psychological wounds. Generations of men who had grown up in a system where bodies were property struggled to form healthy relationships. Survivors carried trauma that echoed through families for decades. Even today, genetic studies trace the hidden legacies of these practices across 3 continents. The most tragic consequence, however, was not just individual suffering, but the destruction of trust itself. Parents mutilated their children in attempts to protect them. Boys taken as victims grew into men who selected new victims. Women, forced into harems, were compelled to betray one another to survive. The natural bonds of human love and solidarity were broken, generation after generation. This was the true success of the Ottoman machine. It did not simply exploit individuals, it reshaped entire societies, embedding fear, submission, and exploitation into the cultural fabric. But as the empire fell in 1922, the world was left to grapple with its legacy. And in remembering these horrors, we confront questions not only about history, but about the fragility of civilization itself. The Ottoman Empire endured for more than 600 years. It left behind mosques of breathtaking beauty, administrative systems admired across the world, and a legacy of military brilliance. But woven into that history was another reality, one built on the systematic dehumanization of millions. The most horrifying aspect was not the brutality itself, though the brutality was extreme. It was the bureaucratic efficiency with which cruelty was carried out. Children were not simply kidnapped, they were registered, classified, and tracked across provinces. Castration was not a rare punishment. It was calculated with cold arithmetic, sacrificing 9 boys for every 1 eunuch who survived. Women were not merely exploited, they were priced, trained, and inventoried like livestock. This was not chaos, it was order, a machine of exploitation engineered to operate for centuries. And perhaps most chilling of all was how thoroughly society absorbed it. Generations grew up watching bodies bought and sold on every street corner. Children learned that human worth could be measured in silver, that intimacy could be weaponized, that suffering could be turned into spectacle. The system became so normalized that even its victims sometimes became its enforcers. When the empire finally collapsed in 1922, it left behind scars that did not fade. Survivors carried lifelong wounds, psychological, physical, and spiritual. Families were destroyed across generations. Men shaped by exploitation often lost the capacity for genuine intimacy. Women who endured slavery were left with traumas too deep to heal. Even today, genetic studies trace the remnants of this history across populations. But remembering these horrors is not about condemning modern Turkey, nor Islam as a faith. It is about understanding how power corrupts, how institutions can twist sexuality, intimacy, and family into tools of control. It is about seeing how quickly dehumanization can become normalized when it serves the interests of the powerful. The last Ottoman Sultan was deposed less than a century ago. This history is not ancient, it is uncomfortably close within living memory of grandparents and great-grandparents still alive today. That proximity forces us to confront a sobering truth. Civilization is fragile. When systems begin to treat people as property, when governments calculate human lives as economic assets, when cruelty is normalized as law atrocities are not only possible, they become inevitable. The lesson of the Ottoman sexual system is not locked in the past. It echoes forward, reminding us to remain vigilant. Human dignity cannot be negotiable. Once it is compromised, whether by law, by economy, or by culture, an entire society can descend into darkness, dragging countless generations with it. The archives still hold the records, the earth still yields the bones, and history still whispers the names of the forgotten children, women and men whose humanity was stolen in the name of empire. Their stories deserve to be remembered, their suffering deserves to be acknowledged, and their humanity must be restored not through silence, but through truth.